We are back in open session. The time is 2:05 p.m. Our next order of business is agenda item number 6, the presentation of certificates of appreciation for former members James Turner and Carol Wallish. Would you please approach? Thank you so much for your service on the Physical Therapy Board of California. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're both missed very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you for your service.
Can we do a photo op?
Sure.
Get in front. Another one.
How about one in front of everybody?
There we go.
Sure. You guys get in the middle.
Alicia, what are you doing? Over here.
I thought you guys were behind. Behind you. It's all right.
Stand on your tippy toes. I like the hiding. Thank you.
Thank you both very much.
Parting remarks, be nice to each other.
Wise words.
Nice hat.
Thank you, Carol and James. We really appreciate your service. Our next order of business is agenda item number 7, discussion and possible board action regarding increase of exempt level of the executive officer. Ricardo De La Cruz will be making a brief presentation.
Good afternoon, members of the board. Thank you for having me today. My name is Ricardo De La Cruz. I'm the Personnel Officer for the Department of Consumer Affairs. I'm here today to discuss the proposal that the board is considering in regards to the exempt level increase for the executive officer position for this board. My staff have had an opportunity to review the draft request, analyze the data that's contained in it. We have very few revisions to it, mostly just cosmetic, mostly just enhancers to it. For the most part, the request has indicated the significant change in the scope of the board that the board has seen since the last time the position has been reviewed. My only recommendation to the changes is to including the potential growth that the board may see, and that's one of the things that when boards consider making a change to positions or increasing the exempt level increase is taking into account the scope in which that the board could change. And when we have these parallel tracks that most of these exempt positions tie to a civil service classification, we look at the comparable classification that and the limitations of that particular classification. And what that can do, the negative impact that can have, is that limits the growth that can happen. And what I mean by the limitations of the growth, I do mean in terms of the level of oversight and the management that can be put in place. We can add several layers of employees, of rank and file employees, but if we don't have the appropriate management staff to oversee the rank and file staff, that later on in turn creates an issue when it comes to oversight, when it comes to regulations, when it comes to, more importantly, our enforcement side of board functions. So my only recommendation in terms of this draft request is to also take into account future growth and how this board may benefit from a higher level classification. If there's any questions from the board, I'm willing to answer as many as possible.
Thank you. Do any of the members have questions about the report or any questions for Mr. De La Cruz while he's present?
question. What is it that will actually be submitted? This letter and any of the supporting documents, or what gets submitted?
So my understanding is really what we're talking about today is just attachment 6, which we'll be presenting to HR. HR is welcome to attachments 1 through 5 to use in their support. We collected this data for the board's decision-making process.
The one that's the comparison sheet, is that the one?
Correct.
So I did have a question on that, and the licensee population, that may be the number of licenses that you're at, but it doesn't really correlate to any of the application and licensing reports, and I don't think it weakens anything. So I was just curious what that number is.
So that is, well, because it's combined between PT and PTA and all the special certifications, keep in mind that that's a capture in time of when the data was collected. And the variance can come from inactive to active, delinquent to current, and those kind of things. So when this data was collected, that was the number of what we could consider renewable licenses at the time.
Okay. And now that you say that, our new reporting doesn't show delinquent. I was looking at the licensing statistics report.
Sure. So
Does that include delinquents, though, in that number?
that would be considered a renewable license.
So okay. It's still, about 4,000 difference, though. I mean, it's a pretty decent difference. It's not
I'll have to
like
verify
a
it.
couple. That's the only thing I would recommend, is that it be something that's consistent
Sure.
or somebody could track.
Sure. And in our efforts past this point, working with HR, we'll make sure that the data is valid.
But to answer your question about which documents will be forwarded over to the administration for consideration of this move, we will whatever is submitted by the board, we will pass along. What Consumer Affairs does is essentially facilitate and act as the spokesperson on behalf of the board to try to advocate for this as much as possible. We provide any other additional clarifying information. So they may ask whether budgetarily, if the board can sustain an increased expenditure of this kind. But I believe your request actually already addressed that issue, which is greatly appreciated.
I have a question regarding your suggestion about including projected changes. And I guess part of the question is for Jason and for staff is, have we, because I didn't see that information included in the report, in any of this report. Do we have projections? Have we made projections about what we think growth is going to be with the licensing population?
Yeah, absolutely. So for our internal planning, projections are really important. When we present information from the outside, you kind of have to be careful on what those projections include. So in most cases where you're trying to justify something, you're talking about what's your worst case scenario, what's your doomsday situation. And so where you might anticipate and project things like costs that you know are sure are going to come, you may not project increases in revenue because it's not contextual to that conversation. With this new piece of advice, it would be something that we'd be happily, providing, because I think it does support the narrative.
And so following that, because that's a projection, it's an estimate, it's not a known. And because I want to be, I would love to say, we know we're going to grow, so let's request the highest step level that we can. But I know that that's not realistic. So I'm wondering, how do we project and request an appropriate amount without over requesting and trying to make sure that we don't under request? And how long are we looking at these numbers holding valid before we have to go down this path again?
My recommendation would be to look at, generally the state likes increments of 3. So if you can look at the past 3 years and look at what the rate of growth is, it would give you a somewhat fair estimate based on the economy, how the economy has rebounded to a certain degree over the past 3 years. It'll give you a good sense of terms of how the growth has been or shown. And you can project probably what the next 3 years will probably look like and what potential growth will be. Also, looking at your licensee rate to see how much that has grown over the past 3 years in addition. Also looking at BCPs for the budget change proposals to see how what's the average in terms of position growth that the board has experienced, what the workload has experienced. If there's new legislation that has increased the workload, that we can see potential growth in as a result of either potential legislation or current legislation that's being enacted.
In any of the data that we try to collect projection-wise, we usually do a 3 to 5 year range. And so when we're looking at something as an example in enforcement, we're trying to anticipate the number of complaints we might be receiving next year. We use the last 3 years to 5 years of data to build that trend data, just to kind of use that as an estimate, as well as with costs or applications received or renewals process or something like that. Renewals process is a really key kind of element because it kind of tells us over time what our licensing population growth is going to sustain, because as you have new applicants coming in, you also have people going into a canceled status or delinquent status and terming out. So we're always trying to anticipate that internally. We've just never added it into this type of equation. But again, I think that it's something that, because I like to plan for the future. As you guys can kind of tell when we talk about things like fees and 2-month fund conditions make me nervous. So I'd rather plan for a rainy day. But this idea of looking at the exempt status and determining what level is appropriate, I think is, you can get as close as you can with the data that you have in front of you, and then should things change 4, 5, 10 years down the road, you come back and you do it again as appropriate.
And one of the issues that I had brought up the last time that I addressed the board, and I feel it's my responsibility to continue to educate boards on, is that it's not necessarily about Executive Officer Kaiser's performance or indicative of his efforts, but it's more about the position and more about the board and how the structure of the board and what leadership and what really what the structure and the organizational flow of that board should look like. It's not necessarily, and it's no disrespect to Executive Officer Kaiser, but it's also a recruitment tool for future. It's ensuring that all the positives and all the exemplary performance of Executive Officer Kaiser is still continued with future candidates, that you attract someone of that same caliber and that same skill set, knowledge, skills, and abilities.
And I know that the budget woes of the state that we've had in the past have affected the ability for this issue to be approached and to be addressed. But the last time that this was adjusted was in 2000. So we've gone 16 years without a significant change. And I know that that's not an appropriate time length, but what kind of time frame should we be looking at for the next kind of major review?
A review should be done anytime either significant legislation or significant changes or conditions occur that are impacting the board. So it is very well possible that we are reviewing this again a year from now, or we're reviewing this 2 or 3 years from now, or 5 years from now. It's just as conditions change, we should be always looking at our organizational structure.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any further comments from the board? Okay, then I move to support DCA, the Office of Human Resources, to work with the PTPC staff and appropriate agencies in obtaining an exempt level increase for the PTPC's EO position. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Second by Dr. Alviso. Any further comment from the board? Any public comment? Roll call vote.
Katerina Ellaby,
Aye.
Alicia Rabena Amen,
Aye.
Deborah Alviso,
Yes.
Jesus Dominguez,
Aye.
Tanya McMillian,
Yes.
TJ Watkins.
The vote was unanimous. Thank you.
Oh, Mr. Drummer.
Mr. Trummer.
Excuse me. Dr. Drummer.
Yes.
Thank you.
The vote was now unanimous. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. De La Cruz, for your time today. We appreciate you coming in person to help
Thank you.
support this decision.
Also, is there a specific exempt level that the board will be considering?
Ms. Scott?
I'll wait until you make the decision. And then remind you that you'll have to take a vote on that.
Is that something we can discuss now? Does any of the board members have a preference based on the data that was provided? Do we think it needs more research, or can we come to a decision? Exempt level L? Mhm. Is everybody comfortable with that, considering the additional growth and forecasting that you mentioned?
Is that what's in the draft letter?
It is.
That's what I kind of thought I was approving.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to move again with the exempt level L as the board has decided.
I second.
All right. Any public comment? All those in favor? Aye for
Oh,
Ellaby.
roll call vote.
Roll call vote.
Katerina Ellaby,
Aye.
Alicia Rabena Amen,
Aye.
Deborah Alviso,
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez,
Aye.
Daniel Drummer,
Aye.
Tanya McMillian,
Yes.
TJ Watkins.
Aye.
Thank you.
Daniel, did you get your vote in? The vote was unanimous. Thank you, Brooke. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Is that it? Okay.
Our next order of business is agenda item number 8, review and approval of May 18th and 19th minutes.
Okay, so for the board's consideration are the draft meeting minutes from the May 2016 meeting. I'll go through page by page. Were there any edits to the first page? There were 2 that were brought to my attention prior to the meeting. The first was under agenda item 2, subsection A. It states on line 17 that Mr. Watkins was appointed by the governor. However, it should be changed to the Speaker of the Assembly. Under agenda item 2B, line 22, it was also brought to my attention that it should say, enumerable contributions instead of enumerable with an I. Were there any other edits for page 1?
I think we're good.
All right. Page 2. Page 3. Page 4.
I had one suggestion on line 133.
Mhm.
For 200,000 plus views to her Facebook, I maybe would say to the PTBC Facebook posts.
Okay. All right, going on to page 5. Page 6.
Page 6, there's a typo on line 224 where it has the quote, "When are you too inebriated?" TOO, I believe, is the edit there.
Thank you. All right, page 7. Or is that?
I think that's the end.
Sorry, that's
I would
in.
say that's it.
Any other comments from the board? Any public comment? Can we get a roll call vote to approve these minutes and our motion to approve the minutes?
I move to approve them.
Second. All those in favor?
Katerina Ellaby,
Aye.
Alicia Rabena Amin,
Aye.
Deborah Alviso,
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez,
Aye.
Daniel Drummer,
Aye.
Tanya McMillian,
Aye.
TJ Watkins.
Aye.
Thank you.
All right, the minutes have been deemed approved. Moving on to agenda item number 9, the president's report. We're going to look at the 2017 adopted meeting calendar. And I believe Jason would like to add some comments about our upcoming November meeting.
Yeah, for the 2016 calendar. And this is kind of a circular conversation because it relates to the topic that we'll be talking about later with Sunset. I would like to ask the board to consider delaying the November meeting for 1 week. And that will give staff a little bit more of time or cushion to prepare the Sunset report, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It's something that we had talked about previously, and we kind of moved that November date around a couple times. But I don't think at the time of those discussions, we were really anticipating getting the Sunset questions as late into the session as we did. So if it's something that the board would entertain, I think staff would appreciate it.
Will location remain the same?
Location would remain
It
the
would.
same. Do any board members have a conflict with the 16th and 17th of November?
And with the help of President Ellaby, we've actually managed to confirm that that location can be for the 16th and 17th. And we have a hold on that until we can actually determine whether it be the 9th, 10th, or the 16th or 17th.
Alicia, are you good?
It's fine.
It's fine? Are there any objections?
I'll just make a comment. I have teaching obligations that I'll need to adjust.
Okay.
The students happen to be gone on the 9th and 10th rotations, but they'd be back. So just a comment.
Okay.
Work on it.
Is it feasible? Yeah.
Sure, it's feasible.
Well, it's important to note that
Yeah.
this ask is just kind of a consideration. It really does only give us, 7 more days of cushion, if you will. But so if it is something that is a conflict, that November meeting will be extremely important to have all board members present because we will be, at that point, hopefully, all things working out the way they should, adopting the report that we'll be submitting to the legislature on December 1st.
I don't have a conflict, but just a personal choice is to keep it the same.
If the 9th is proving to be a possible conflict for me, and so I might be able to make it for the 10th, but I could make it for the 2 days the next week, but whatever works for the group.
Any other board comments?
So sounds like the rest of us can make it all the other times, and Dr. Dominguez will try his best to move it. But
It's going to be in Los Angeles.
yeah, but Deborah might have to miss if we keep it at the 9th and 10th.
Exactly.
So I'm fine for moving it if
Okay.
everyone else is.
Would you like to move it?
We need to move it?
We do need a motion to adopt a new date.
You do need a motion for the new date because the current one is actually adopted, and my other concern is it doesn't indicate on the agenda that you were taking action item on changing an already adopted board decisions.
I move to move our November date to the 16th and 17th of November.
Do we have a second? Second by Ms. McMillan. All those in favor?
And before
Oh,
we
wait,
go,
I'm sorry.
because it's
Any-
already an adopted decision, is there any public comment
Yeah,
on this
thank you,
specific
Angelique.
change on the previously adopted board calendar? None. Thank you.
Katerina Ellaby,
Aye.
Alicia Imen,
Aye.
Deborah Alviso,
Yes.
Jesus Dominguez,
I'd like to say aye, 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 but I'll just say aye.
Daniel Drummer,
Yes.
Tanya McMillian,
Aye.
TJ Watkins.
Aye.
Thank you.
The vote was unanimous. Moving on to agenda item 9B, the 2017 proposed meeting calendar.
Just a second chance to come back and look at this calendar again before it's completely adopted. If anybody has any conflicts on the schedule that have arisen since our last meeting.
I may have a conflict on the 17th of May, and I'm open to moving it if others have conflicts, but if not, then I can make some arrangements. Hearing none, I think we're going to keep it where it is.
Moving that date is not problematic, only in the sense that that's one of those particular meetings because of how late the meeting in August is, that there's a longer span of time than normal. I don't know if this constitutes a conflict in the schedule, but I would also be interested in moving it. That would be the second year that I've had a board meeting birthday, if it stays where it is. Not that you guys aren't great hosts for birthdays, because you absolutely are.
Would you advise us to move it up to the 10th and 11th?
I would actually go the other way.
Oh,
I would go
okay.
24th and 25th, so that there's not as much of a span between meetings in case we have disciplinary hearings or something that are time sensitive.
Okay.
And I don't know about location. Sometimes if we're looking at a school, then the later we get in May, the tougher it gets. But if we're not looking at a location at a program, it probably doesn't matter.
That's a very good point. The May meeting of 2017, we are actually targeting Dr. Dominguez and USC. So if he might chime in.
We're pretty flexible.
So one of the other things that we're looking at when we go to an educational institution is to try and get future applicant participation. Would that be difficult at that given time?
Yeah, but let me see what our 2017, typically graduate the second Friday in May without really having looked ahead. I'm going to suspect that that's going to be, so it's going to be the 13th of May?
The 12th of May.
Or sorry, Saturday, the 12th of May.
So even if we were thinking about moving it to the 10th and 11th, so now my birthday is less of a concern, more it's really about getting applicants in the seats kind of thing. If the 10th and 11th was there, that graduation being that Friday, are students really in attendance during the 10th and 11th at that point?
Let's see, we usually have an awards ceremony the evening of the 11th. All the graduates would sort of be there towards the evening hours on Thursday. So they don't have any obligations on Wednesday, the 10th. But,
Okay.
so we'd be done with finals.
It's funny how variables change determinations. So I would be more interested in getting an audience with future applicants than spending my birthday at home.
Just to clarify, Dr. Dominguez, are you suggesting we move the meeting to the 10th and 11th so we can capture them on Wednesday the 10th?
I think I could make a case for pretty good attendance on that Wednesday and Thursday. As opposed to, it'll be, well, we would be asking them to come back 2 weeks after, almost 2 weeks after commencement, or 1 week after, 2 weeks, I'm sorry, after commencement. They may or may not.
So there is some, and this might be for a discussion at a later time, but there is some complication in the calendar now that education has risen to the DPT level because the graduation dates have kind of offset the whole calendar. Going to Southern California in May maybe in the future we should reconsider that and look at kind of switching them and doing, coming to Sacramento in May and going to Southern California, say, in February. And that might help a little bit with actually getting that applicant audience.
I agree. Does anybody have a conflict for May 10th and 11th?
So I want to expand on that thought one more time. If a member were to make a motion that we were going to move the location of the February meeting to Southern California, would USC be able to host us at that time?
In February,
Mm-hmm.
I would say yes, but I don't have the ultimate authority
Yeah,
to say
I
that.
appreciate that. I understand. I do.
Yeah,
So an option could be is that we switch the Sacramento February and the May Southern California and just switch them. And if USC can't host, then we could, go to a hotel or something at that time. We could always make arrangements at a state building or something like that if we needed a backup. But I think, at some point an adjustment's going to have to be made in the calendar to account for the transition to DPT and the longer education time. So maybe now is no better time than the present.
I like
I think
the
our
idea.
calendar over the years has kind of shifted from April to May, and now it's later in May. So if you did that, then maybe moving that May, it could be later, right? To the 24th.
Yeah, you could at that point.
Do we have a motion to switch the Southern California meeting to February for the potential of having more potential applicants participate in our board meetings?
I do, with the movement also of the May dates to the 24th and 25th.
Second. Do we have any further board discussion?
just to be clear, we are talking about February 2017.
Correct.
Okay.
Any public comment? All those in favor?
Katarina Elby,
Aye.
Alicia Rabina Amin,
Aye.
Deborah Alvizo,
Yes.
Jesus Dominguez,
Yes.
Daniel Drummer,
Yes.
Tanya McMillan,
Yes.
TJ Watkins.
Aye.
Thank you.
The vote was unanimous. Do any other members have any comments on the 2017 calendar? All right. Let's move on to agenda item, well, we need to vote to approve the entire calendar, do we not? Or did we just approve it as amended?
Ms. Scott?
I'm sorry, I was taking notes. Can you repeat the question?
Do we need to vote to approve the entire calendar, or did we just approve it as amended?
It was my understanding it was approved as amended.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Okay, moving on to agenda item number 10, the Executive Officer's Report.
So I'll be brief, because of a compacted schedule, really. If the board members have any questions, there's a couple things that I'd like to highlight. In budget and personnel, I would like to point out that we have a recent Conley accepting an out-of-class position as the SSM1, or the manager over the applications and licensing unit. I can't tell you how beneficial that's going to be now that we can kind of provide a little bit better oversight and not, it used to be Elsa, Liz, and I, and now it's Elsa, Liz, and I, and Sarah, if that tells you anything. So we're going to exploit Sarah's talents as much as we possibly can without being too intrusive. So one, I'd also like to thank her for accepting the audit class while we go through the recruitment process, but we really appreciate it. Under Breeze, we are still undergoing what we call service information requests and work authorizations. So we move from release to release, and we're making tweaks and fine tuning and that kind of thing. So we are considered release 2. And since the deployment, we've gone through release 2.1, 2.11, 2.12. 2.13, and I think 2.14 is next, and that's in a little less than 2 weeks. So we're going into what we call user acceptance testing. And whenever a change is made, we have to go through that same process that we did in design to make sure that those changes don't have any unforeseen outcomes and that everything works properly before we deploy it. So with Vincent and Sarah and key members of staff, user acceptance testing is now almost kind of a norm because the releases are coming so quickly. One of the things that we've seen or identified as being a potential problem in the future is that identifying which things get put into releases is done on a priority matrix, similar to what we do with enforcement cases. And there are a number, because we're towards the end of a legislative session now, there are a number of legislative bills that will create changes that need to be accounted for in Breeze. Well, because they're legislation, they rise to the top, and they can be very resource heavy. What that does is it moves the rest of those things farther down the list. So some of those efficiencies that we thought we might see in June and July, that kind of thing, well, now at this point, even later, may not happen for over a year. And we're also under a deadline in contract where this time next year, the support that we receive from the vendor could possibly be cut in half because of the contract of where we are. So it's just something that I want to kind of put out there so the board understands we try as best we can to fine tune the experience that the end user has. And I know some members have recently ventured into Breeze to do things like renewals and that kind of thing. And some of those changes that we've implemented, you just missed them by like a 30-day window. So look forward to them. And as they happen, I think it'll be a good idea to present them here. Some of them are, they have to be visual. Like I'd actually have to show you how it works. But needless to say, the effort put into it is enormous. So other than that, the next thing that project-wise that we're really looking at is starting back into continuing competency, doing a exploratory audit for licensees, and then also looking at auditing recognized approval agencies. And sometime in the beginning of next year, they'll see that process. So you'll see social media posts and things on the website, and hopefully in a newsletter at that point. The only other item on this report that's not usually there is a new topic of Dca Internal Audits. We are undergoing an internal audit right now. It hasn't happened since 2006, so it's timely. The Department of Consumer Affairs was kind enough to give us a reprieve, a break, if you will, right when Breeze was launching. So we didn't want to have to do an internal audit and launch Breeze at the same time, so it was delayed. We're into it now, and not that the timing is perfect with sunset and that kind of thing, but it has proven to be fairly easy. You know, the only audit that I know of is the audit that we went through with the JLAC, or the Joint Legislative Audit Committee, and that was very intensive, and this is not quite as so. So it's proving to be more of an opportunity, I think, than anything else, because they're going to provide us a recommendation paper of things that might be efficiencies that we didn't know we could even realize. So, and that's all I have for the EO report, if there's anything that you'd like to ask.
I have a couple of questions, Jason. Under outreach, the third topic talks about holding a presentation to the Sacramento State University PT program, and it says it's 3 days.
It is. It's a Monday, and then the following 2 Mondays, possibly a third. So maybe four Mondays in total, but 3 at this point.
Okay. And how long is it's not full day presentation?
No,
Okay.
4 hours, I believe.
4 hours total, or 4 hours each day?
4 hours each day.
Wow. Thank you. And then under continuing competency, can you explain what is the process that's in place for auditing the approval agencies?
So what we've done in the past is we've taken a random sample of people who are considered auditable. So recently renewed and have attested to their continuing competency requirement. after the fact. So recently renewed and valid, those are the only two conditions that would make you eligible for audit.
So that's for the licensee.
Correct.
What about the approval agencies?
So
Is
for
there anything there?
For both categories, there is an additional criteria. So when we run across a consumer complaint that leads us to think that there's a continuing competency, we can also audit that licensee at that time. So they don't have to be randomly selected. They can be selected for cause. And that will be the same condition for the recognized approval agency. We'll start with a small sample. And then if we have any reason to believe that one audit or one recognized approval agency needs to be audited, like we've had a complaint about a particular course or something like that, we'll include them in that list as well.
Okay, so it can be, so it needs to be complaint based.
Or random.
Or it can be random.
Yes,
okay.
absolutely.
And, okay.
And we'll use what they call a sufficient compliance model. So we'll start with a smaller percentage. The result of that, if it's greater than 50% that fail the audit, then that's a point where you would consider in your next audit to increase the sample rate. So if we started at 5 and we found out of that 5%, over half of them failed the audit, we would increase the sample rate to 10. And then the opposite too, if that happens to be the case. If we audit 5% and they all pass, then we could also think about lowering the sample rate.
Okay, thank you. And then under the DCA internal audit, is it a randomly selected audit that, or is it something that we're scheduled to have done?
It's not random, so they have a periodic calendar that they follow, and we're well past due. So when I say 2006, it's over 10 years, and I think that they'd like to conduct those audits anywhere from 5 to 6 year samples.
And if they're generally 5 to 6 year samples, do we have infrastructure budgeting to prepare for that, knowing that that we expect every 5 to 6 years that this is coming, so that are we setting aside some budget amount so that when it does happen, we know that it's going to take staff resources away from normal staff activities?
We haven't gone so far as to measure the workload that's involved with an audit. But we already have a temporary help line item on the budget that we utilize whenever the flow increases, and that's probably a more appropriate use of those monies. As I touched on, so far it hasn't been intrusive. It hasn't been an increase in workload at that point. An hour here, an hour there, that kind of thing. Should it surpass that, it would be something that I would consider bringing temporary staff in for to handle that problem.
Everybody's good? Okay. Thank you, Jason.
You're welcome.
Moving right along. Agenda item number 11, discussion and possible board action regarding termination of network participation of licensees as a result of discipline.
So this agenda item was placed at the request of previous board member Carol Walsh at the February board meeting of last year. During a petition for reconsideration, it was revealed through testimony that the probationer had lost his job because he couldn't be considered a provider within a specific network based on his discipline. And she asked that this topic be put on the agenda. So what I've done is we've collected as much evidence as we can as an example for board members to be able to see what that language looks like. And in our research, I think the thing that really kind of shone through was that these are contractual agreements between licensees and insurance companies that were signed well in advance, and that not all of them result in termination. Some programs, insurance programs, I should say, apply certain scrutiny. So it doesn't, because they're disciplined, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be dropped. They actually do look at the violation, the level of egregiousness, and that kind of thing. In our research and what we could find as evidenced in this report is that 3 terminations were a result of discipline. One was a result of failing to notify for the discipline, and one was a result of failing to notify for the discipline and being disciplined. So we are now trying to identify which insurance companies this isn't a problem for, or which insurance companies this is a problem. The other thing to keep in mind is in our own model guidelines, the board makes a statement that it's not their intent that this order or the fact that respondent has been disciplined or respondent is on probation shall be used as a sole basis for any third-party payer to remove respondent from any list of approved providers. So I think the board has done a very good job at expressing its intent and what they expect. Having said that, we don't really have a whole lot of jurisdiction to exercise when it comes to what a contractual agreement between two parties holds. So I leave it open for discussion.
Just wanted to thank staff for doing the research on this subject matter because we weren't really sure where the board stood on this issue and how the providers were coming to the conclusion of removing members from their network. And I think we were concerned that we were creating a barrier for them to employment by putting them on probation. I'm not sure how you got these letters, but they are very informative. So thank you to staff for providing this background. And I think it's key to note that they did agree to this contractually prior to joining the network, and it is their responsibility as a member of the network and as a licensee to be aware of their consequences of their actions.
One of the other things that we've heard in previous hearings was that the employer, the company that insured the employer when it's a clinic, was also given notice from that insurance company, not just from the individual's liability issue, the individual therapist issue, but the employer's liability insurance company was telling the employer, you can't have this employee.
Correct.
So it's not just that an individual is not allowed to practice according to the contract, but the employer of that individual is also receiving information
Correct.
from the contract company, but also from their insurance companies, that that individual was not going to be able to be hired, or the clinic was not going to be allowed to be insured by that company.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that for the insurers, that this is definitely a liability issue for them. So in that case where it's the employer's credential who's being held and they're telling them, we've gone through your list of staff and we found that one of your staff is a probationer, we're not going to be able to credential you for this program unless you get rid of that particular staff person, is the insurance company saying, the reality is that a probationer is a lesser licensee and a greater liability from the eyes of the insurer. I think that's just a stark reality. There's nothing really that we can do about that. I think from a consumer standpoint, that's appropriate. If I was the receiver of the care, those are the kind of things that should be added into the equation between a choice between two licensees for that matter. So, but you're correct. I have seen that as well. I don't have any, because it's the employer, that information is a little bit harder to get our hands on, but.
I remember one particular individual who told us that story in his hearing.
Yeah, the other thing that kind of came through this research too is that that's not always a final outcome. So they can petition and ask for credentialing again later at a later date. And insurance companies will actually do very similar things to what we do here, looking for rehabilitation and what have you done since then, what's your record been while you've been on probation, and those kind of things. So, and they're all done on a case-by-case basis. Each individual insurance company has a different policy.
I just want to make sure to call everybody's attention to one particular line in page 42, the letter that's there to the provider. It's maybe the 7th or 8th line down, that the healthcare provider's license shall not have been revoked within the last 7 years. And very often our disciplinary actions are revocation and stayed. So that person can't work for that insurance company or under a contract with that insurance company for at least 7 years.
That's correct.
After they complete their probation.
There is an appeals process to that with each individual insurance company, but that is the general guideline.
And I think sequela of some of this is that many of those probationers are ending up having to seek employment in the number of clinics greatly reduces. And I think that a large number of those clinics end up being hospital-based clinics, where it's not apparently not seen as a bigger issue, that there's more supervision or something along that line. Because I don't remember ever hearing of anybody who's had a problem who's hospital-based.
I think this is important information for current licensees, but also potential licensees to understand the long-term effects of discipline on their license. Because it's not just the here and now, it's the potentially 7 years from now, my opportunities as a licensed PT or PTA. So again, thank you, staff, for providing this extra insight. Is there any further board comment on this?
Yes. I was looking, so the scope of the board is only to that point, but some of the probationers are being impacted by this. But that is also a direct cause of action that's taken on their part. And now the insurance, which has a different mandate to protect their interests and their liability, is also penalizing them. So my question was this, so we're listening, but it's clearly outside of our scope. Am I correct in saying that?
You're correct.
I just wanted to make
And I think that statement out of the model guidelines is about it actually stretches. It's about as far as you can go as an advisory statement, and that's all it is at that point, is an advisory statement.
Right. Thank you.
Perhaps you can touch on this point when your presentation to Sacramento State.
Yes. Yes.
Any public comment on the issue? Thank you, Jason.
You're welcome.
Okay, agenda item number 12, discussion and possible board action regarding Sunset Review Report pursuant to Business and Professions Code Section 2602. Believe we're going to go over the sunset process and timelines.
The most key point of information in this presentation is how little time we have. So it's a difficult task to bring everyone up to speed as to what sunset is. So we wanted to provide this information as early as possible. Once we received the question template that's attached in the report from the legislature, staff started divvying it up and determining who was responsible for what. But as the composition of this board has changed, we only have one member of the board who has any experience with sunset, and that is Dr. Alviso, who was heavily involved the last time around. So sunset really is our opportunity to present to the legislature why we should exist, why there's a need for regulation over the physical therapy profession. Our accolades, our problems, it's also an opportunity to express to them any kind of concerns that we might have as far as resources, statutes, or authorities granted and that kind of thing that they might be able to help us with. We typically receive this template in March. It's a year-long process, March to March. And this year we received it the last week of July, so we're a couple months behind. Moving forward from here, what's important is considering the rest of this year's calendar, because while we've already determined to change the date for November, other considerations should be made when it comes to sunset, such as adding a date in the month of October, as an example, or if the board sees fit, the month of September as well. What we're going to be doing is comprising a draft of the sunset report, and hopefully with the help of the board, be able to present that draft and work on it together as a group. So now it's a matter of trying to determine schedule. What does it look like? And so there are a couple different options. In our 2011 session, we had a full board meeting in August, in September, in October, and again in November because of how much work needed to be done. We have a little bit of an advantage in this time is that we didn't have as much change from last sunset to now as they had prior to sunset to then. So the alternatives could be maybe a teleconference in August and then a full board conference in September and a full board conference in October, again to meet to decide on a final draft in November. The other ask that we've put in here as an action request is to comprise a committee of 2 members to work with staff. And so those 2 members could work with us in drafting that report that we present at either the teleconference or full meeting for that matter in September, and then again in October, and work on it incrementally through the process. A lot of it is data. A lot of it is just statistics and the kind of things that you see in board meeting minutes. But one of the hardest parts of the Sunset Report, and especially given how much time we have to report, is issues that we want to bring to the legislature's attention. Things that we might ask or want assistance with in change. And so staff has identified a couple key points in this report, but we also ask that the board provide to us anything that they think should be included.
So our options are to work on the Sunset Report as a full board or to delegate this to a committee comprised of 2 board members to work with staff. Do we have any board discussion or any comments on those 2 options? Deborah, since you're the only board member who's participated in Sunset in the past, do you have any suggestions for us?
Well, if I remember so much of compiling the report seems as though it's best done by staff. But there may be helpful points for review before we do it as a group. And so there might be help that a committee could offer or a couple of people could offer. As insight into that reporting, but I really think the staff is probably, can do that much more efficiently.
Sure. And that's part of my plan as well. So if we were to form a committee, it really would be to kind of do early iterations and drafting to present as a draft to the full board. Again, either through a teleconference or through a Sacramento meeting. In 2011, we spent a considerable amount of staff time and board member time putting the report together, just to have the outcome be a delay and that the legislature wouldn't be hearing our sunset that year. They would be hearing us the next session. So in essence, we wrote the report twice. We turned around and rewrote it again through the year of 2012 and essentially made an addendum to every section that's in this report to update or refresh the data. We would collect all this data. We would draft language and with the assistance of 2 members, prepare it for the rest of the board. I do think that there's a value in having the 2 committee members, especially since we're on such a strict timeline this year. It might make us more nimble, more agile. We don't have the same luxuries that we had in the past where we had a full year to draft this report. Now we're talking about 4 months. So once that report is drafted in December and submitted in December, or adopted in November and submitted in December, the hearing to support that report in front of the legislature won't happen probably until March. The legislature will send us back a report with any kind of concerns or questions or things that they might ask us to elaborate on further or be prepared to provide testimony for at the hearing. And then the other ask would be to identify which board members would be testifying at that hearing as well.
Will this report, the last Sunset Report had the Practice Act revisions.
Correct.
So there is a large part of that, I mean, I'm trying to remember if that was part of the bulk of the preparation last time too.
A good portion of the bulk in preparation last time was describing or explaining the changes that had occurred since the 2005 sunset. And there was quite a bit as far as legislation that had changed up to that point. SB 198 was a result of the last sunset report. So that is a change that we're going to be explaining in this sunset report. What regulations had to be promulgated as a result of, or what kind of issues or things that we discovered as a result of 198. Thankfully, 198 was really more of a restructure than anything else. There were a few new authorities kind of peppered in it, but it was mostly restructure. The difference between 2005 and 2012 is that you had really significant legislative changes when it came to supervision, changing to the DPT, and things that were more significant in nature than what we're talking about. That was a difficult report, and I think that's the brunt of how much work needed to be done, was just to explain the differences from 05 to 12. And then the fact that we had to do it twice. That was the other issue, I think, that makes it stand out more.
So Jason, what kind of core skills do you need for this committee and the committee members
So
to make it as efficient and as
Absolutely.
robust, and so you don't have to do it multiple times. You do it once, you clear it out, you've aligned the staff with the committee, and you actually get it done.
So there are a couple things that I think we should consider in creating the committee. It would be good if the committee was actually the board members we picked to present to the legislature as well, just so that it's consistent in preparation. Another key component is, by the nature of her position as the president, I think that's, for me, in my opinion, that's a natural selection as being one of the members in the committee. Other than that, expertise in the profession, accessibility, experience. I think some of these qualities might have greater weight because of the time urgency. So accessibility would be really a key factor for us. We don't have a lot of time to schedule meetings with staff with these two committee members because of the concentrated timeline. So I think that rises a little higher on the list than it normally would. And again, just that they would also be the two members that actually provide testimony to the legislature.
Well, obviously, the reason why I'm asking is because I'm trying to see how do I fit in that, and I'm sure everybody's doing the same thing. It's like, how do I fit in? Because I want to make sure that I bring the kind of skills that can move it forward, as opposed to it turning into a learning environment for me, which I would always sign up for.
Sure.
But I mean, in the bigger part of the process, if there's a timeline, I want to know, how effective I could actually be in the process.
One of the things that I think that's been a key of success for this board is that we're purpose-driven. I mean, we understand our purpose. And at the last sunset hearing, testimony was given by Deborah Alviso and by public member Carol Wallish. And that was, I don't want to say progressive, but I think it was well thought out. And it's especially sensitive today with the North Carolina decision, the Supreme Court decision, that those kind of things be considered as well. I don't know, you probably heard me say this a couple times, but North Carolina needs to be considered in everything we do. So, and this is importantly so.
So I'd like to make a recommendation that the board consider creating the committee of 2 board members, considering the request from staff and the factors of time that we have sort of working against us in this review process. So I would be happy to volunteer as one of the committee members. If anybody else would like to volunteer or nominate themselves.
I'm willing to help, but I'm willing to help, like I said, the rings around the tree, and I've seen some of these issues as they came up, but I'm also sensitive that you know, whoever we need to do it. If it's that somebody else needs the experience, then I'm totally fine with that. So I might suggest that another person be on the committee, but that I'm available if anything's needed for a question or an issue.
Well, for me personally, you know, I don't have too much experience in the actual profession. That's the thing that I'm battling with. You know, the rest of it, you know, you can do the writing aspect of it. And so I don't know if me volunteering is moving it forward. I'm questioning whether it moves it forward or do I actually bring any tangible skills to it, you know.
And if I could point out that I believe that the staff is recommending that the board consider a two-person committee. So if you are not on the two-person committee, the staff would not be able to contact you outside of the committee unless it's at the full board meeting. Otherwise, there might be a violation of the Open Meeting Act. I believe your statement was to the effect, it's okay if there are two others on the committee and not myself, but feel free to contact me. If that is extended to the committee, that would be inappropriate because there might be a violation of the Open Meeting Act if they're contacting you about the committee business outside of the actual full board meeting. So to keep that in mind.
Oh, and I wasn't thinking of it as related to the committee. I was
The
thinking
hearing.
of it if someone was dealing with an issue. Not so much in the committee, but I appreciate that.
All right, thank you.
So,
Does it have to be a two per?
so the
person
beauty of the two-person committee is that it is more flexible and nimble in that it's not a publicly noticed meeting at that point. So if staff needed to reach out to the committee, we wouldn't have to go through the 10-day process and publicly notice it and have the public in attendance and that kind of thing. So that part of the two-committee meeting is, I think, what staff is looking for the most, especially with the compacted timeline. I think another portion of the conversation has to happen before we select who the members are, because I think a lot of it depends on what you identify as issues moving forward in the Sunset Report. If there are practice-related issues, I think that changes the weight, if you will, as to where expertise comes into play. If those are not the types of issues that the board wants to identify in the Sunset session, then again, I think public representation is important through the Sunset process. President Ellaby being a public member, I think sends a very clear and distinct signal. Having another public member would just echo that, which I think is appropriate given the climate. Having said that, if the issues are expertise-based for the profession, then that should be considered as well.
So is staff recommending that we do not select the specific committee members today, but
No, I would definitely like to have you select them
Okay.
today. I just think that, so we have to have the conversation about what issues we would like to identify. So staff has compiled what we can see as potential issues. And this is we have what we consider problems. And in those problems, it depends on the perspective. When I say practice-related issues, some of the things that come to my mind right away are things like dry needling and animal rehabilitation and mobilization or manipulation or something like that. Those, for me, are better left to the association, to the professional association to drive, because they're not so much consumer-based or consumer-driven. The things that I'm looking at that staff has identified are very much consumer-driven or administrative problems. So, as an example, future eligibility requirements for the examination by FSPPT, including Coursework Tool 6. That is an issue that's philosophical in nature, but it's a barrier to licensure kind of idea. So I think it's very appropriate for a regulation or for a regulatory board to chime in on that and identify it to the legislature. So keeping that in mind, if there's any other kind of topics that board members would like to have added to this list for consideration in the issues, that may sway or change who we choose to be the two committee members.
So could we move to the paper that has the issues on it and maybe
Yes.
come back to the committee?
Before we go that far, so the only thing that I wanted, and this is just a visual kind of exercise, is that we provided the sunset review process as a timeline that was provided by DCA. We mirrored what is now our actual timeline below it, so you can see the compaction. But it's also a very informative display. DCA has done a very good job at breaking it down process-wise, so we can see step by step what the expectation is. And if you go into the year of 2017, you'll see that it doesn't quite end there. It continues throughout that next year with things like responses and after the Sunrise Bill is created, any new authorities would have to be reported on for a period of time and such. So. Again, just a really excellent reference to have to go back to see how long this process actually is. So moving to the background paper that Brooke did for us for recommendations for Sunset, out of the ones that we provided to the board, if there are any questions or comments on any one particular topic, I'd be happy to help.
Okay, so if we take a look at the one for the, I'm sorry, I'm trying to find it here. For the coursework tool 6. So that's something that we want to use, but we are not allowed to use it because we do not have, we can't use a tool, an evaluation tool as of right now.
We use them now. So we use coursework tools 1 through 5, which we call the retro tools. And the retro tools were designed to measure education and equivalency at the time the education was administered.
Okay.
So if they were a graduate in 1980, they would use coursework tool 3 as an example. So what's happening now is that as an eligibility requirement to the examination, FSBPT has determined that all applicants with foreign education should be evaluated at 2015 standards.
Okay.
So what we call coursework tool 6. The issue that we have with that is that our own statutes say that the equivalency shall be done at the time the education was received. So CAPTE accreditation in 1980 versus the foreign education they received and the evaluation there. The reason I say it's philosophical in nature is because this is only one prong of a three-prong table. So you have education, examination, and background check. They would still have to take today's MPTE and pass it to attain licensure. But this does become an issue between the state of California and FSBPT because they're using it as an eligibility to the examination requirement. If they can't be considered equivalent using the new coursework tool 6, which in reality, the idea that somebody educated in 1990 being held to the same standard of 2015, they're going to have to go back and take some additional classes to fulfill deficiencies. They're not going to be considered equivalent. That's the reality of the matter. Having said that, they're now not going to be able to take the exam and or submit an application, and that could be a barrier to licensure. We also would do that equivalency ourselves. So nothing says that we can't use coursework tools 1 through 5, because we currently do. But FSBPT would say they would need an exemption to allow them into the exam, similar to the appeal process that we have now with the lifetime limit or the low score limit as an appeal because it creates a statutory conflict for the state. This is another statutory conflict for the state. It's just something that I think we didn't consider at the time. And quite honestly, I'm torn as to how I see this playing out, because with my experience with foreign applicants who come in, who their education comes from, even the late 90s and early 2000s, they're having to take the DPT level MPTE. and they have a hard time passing the exam. So one of the ideas is this is a more humane way to handle it because you're having them be better prepared before they take the national exam and will have a higher success rate. But at the same time, shouldn't they have the freedom to be able to take that exam and fail and then take it again after they decide to remediate or not remediate, just take a second attempt? That really is the decision process should be that of the applicant and not of the regulatory board. It's a measure of minimum competency that I'm most concerned with. If they can pass the exam and their education can be considered equivalent and they can pass the background check, they should be granted a license.
Remind me what would happen, how someone's education would be evaluated if they were U.S. trained and they were coming to California. Would it just be that they were CAPD accredited?
That's correct, and there's an inconsistency in protection there. So you could have someone who went through a CAPD accredited program in the late 70s, early 80s, 90s, or what have you, and there is no evaluation criteria at that point. We would take that as education. That would fulfill the requirement. They would still have to take today's MPTE.
And the coursework tools are based on the CAPD
Correct.
equivalent at that time. So
Correct.
we would be using the tools like we have. We are treating similar educated time
Absolutely.
the same.
Right. So coursework tool represents a period in time. Coursework tool represents a different period in time, or two represents a different period in time, which is why we call them the retro tools.
And as I understand the coursework tool 6, so if the foreign trained physical therapist cannot take the MPTE before the coursework tool is finished or filled out, there are other ways that they can make up certain deficiencies in hours to
Absolutely.
complete that coursework tool, right?
Absolutely. So the other main reason for having a coursework tool is to identify deficiencies and provide a roadmap to those applicants to go back and attain those courses that created those deficiencies. So if it was determined through the equivalency process that there was certain chemistry or biology classes that weren't deemed equivalent, the applicant now has the opportunity to go back to school and attain those credits to be considered again at a later date through the same evaluation process, but at least having some guidance in how to fulfill those deficiencies. And that can be an extensive amount of time, an extensive amount of classes, given that you're considering 1989 to 2015.
And how many licensees are we talking about this impacting? If I go to the application information.
Oh, that's a good, I don't have a number really as far as who would start having to use coursework tool 6. The number is, if we follow FSBPT's guidelines, is all of them. So a better number for me to report to you at a later date is how many have been done at coursework 1, coursework tool 2, coursework tool 3, so you could see that kind of impact. It's not uncommon now through the application process to even get coursework tool 1s. So FSBPT did a study of the time it takes for an applicant to choose to leave the country of their origin and come to the United States, and it's an average of about 10 years. So they practice in their country for about 10 years before they decide to move to the United States. So having said that, the greatest number of coursework tools at that point would be 4. We would be seeing coursework tool 4 the most.
And so this is placed in here as an issue, as a conflict, but for it to go into sunset, would there need to be kind of a board position on this then?
Right. So we identify it as an issue for the board to consider as to whether or not they even want to. If you think that the current statutes that are employed today are appropriate and that we should use the retro tools, then it's not appropriate for sunset. No change needed. No legislative change needed. At that point, we would have to go back to the Federation and say, as we have in the past, we have a statutory conflict. This is just a time that we've identified an issue that if the board should want to consider a change, sunset is a likely vehicle for that kind of change.
So the question is then, it looks like there's going to be a decision that will have to be made, whether it's at this stage on either changing the legislation down the line or right now through sunset, because I don't foresee FSBT having less course tools moving forward.
Correct.
So this is going to be an ongoing issue that will arise at least for the state
Yeah, so
in terms of this conflict.
the alternative moving from here is if the board should decide that there's no statutory change needed, we would identify this as a statutory conflict with the eligibility requirements that FSBPT set into place. A negotiation would have to occur between us and FSBPT as to whether or not that's that's something that they're willing to accept as an appeal process like they have in the past with the lifetime ban or the too low score limit. And if that's the case, what happens then is California potentially could turn into what they call a gateway state. So those foreign applicants that are applying in other states that are that state is holding to the coursework tool 6 and they were found to be deficient may come to California because we still use the retro tools and we might be able to get them licensed here. The gateway state influx, you could have worse problems. I mean, you'd have more practitioners coming into your state, and some of those practitioners may not intend on staying here. They might be using it as a vehicle to get into another state through reciprocity, assuming that that other state hasn't identified that as a problem also, because that might end up being the case where they say no reciprocity for foreign applicants coming from California because California doesn't use coursework tool 6, as an example. But that, I think, comes back to the beginning of this conversation where we have to determine is this new eligibility requirement appropriate as a licensure requirement, because that's what effectively it would do if we change it, and what further protection does that provide? And a good example was over a CAPTI accredited applicant from the 80s applying for licensure for the first time, because that would be something I think that the board would have to consider as far as rationalizing the change.
I think you hit the nail on the head, Jason. It's supposed to be evaluating minimal competence. And so to expect somebody who has been practicing from the 80s to be measured against somebody who just graduated with a DPT, I think is, in my opinion, unfair. And I'd love to hear how the board feels about that.
Yeah, my question is, if we are expecting our current day CAPTI graduates to graduate with a certain, level of education and experience, why would we accept anything less from a foreign educated PT?
So, and that is one comparison that you can make. The other comparison I think that needs to be thought about is through equivalency, I think time still becomes a component that needs to be considered, because again, if the CAPTI accredited graduate comes to me for licensure or application for licensure for the very first time, but they graduated from PT school in 1990, they are, for purposes of argument, a lesser graduate than a 2015 graduate. It's a different level of education. That loophole is open today. We would consider that education. We have no rules in the books that say education has to be attained at a certain level when. There's a grandfathering in, if you will, at that point. The other thing to consider is that those that are already licensed with that educational level are practicing today. And so you have to consider where you draw the line in the sand for protection of the public. When is it appropriate? Again, keeping all things in mind when it comes to things like Supreme Court decisions and that kind of thing. This is also something that you could look at that would be considered a barrier to licensure.
I think I'm sorry.
I just want to remind the board that we're on the topic of discussion of issues to include in the board's sunset review report. So we want to be conscientious about how in-depth of the discussion and trying to resolve that issue or the issues that are proposed and the potential issues for the actual sunset report, and keep it more in line with just trying to get enough information to maybe develop whether or not it should go and be considered in the committee, and for the board members to take into account whether or not they feel as though they have enough experience to participate in the committee. I do understand that there should be some discussion if you're not clear and or certain about the issue that's spotted, but be conscientious that these specific agenda items that are in the briefing paper were not actually noticed on the agenda. So we don't want too much board discussion and opinion in that regard. This should just be for your edification before moving forward with the committee. Thank you.
Good point. I think that this topic is important enough to include. Yeah.
The first topic that is listed on the briefing paper is that of our statutory caps for fees. And having just recently raised our fees to the statutory caps, I think it's an important opportunity, if you will, to have those caps adjusted. Not with the idea of raising the fees anytime soon. That's not my point, but being prepared for whatever might occur in the future. If something should happen where the fees, it was necessary to increase them statutorily, right now we do not have that option. And if those circumstances arose, we would have to seek legislative change, and that can be a very lengthy process through the legislative session, and we would have to seek an author who was sympathetic to the cause, which is why it's included here on the briefing paper.
In that same topic, somewhere on a parking lot in my brain is something about a fee related to continuing competency that we realized was missing, and I don't know if that was to the agency or the individuals. I don't remember.
We actually corrected it in 198.
We did.
And that was being able to charge a fee for recognized approval agencies. And there are a couple different methodologies we can use in charging those fees, but they require regulation. So I don't know that it's something that would be topical during this agenda item, but I remember that on the parking lot as well, so we could probably bring that back at a later time.
But the authorization already exists.
It does.
Okay, I think that was it then.
So the third item has to do with electromyography. One of the things that caused us to place it on this briefing paper is the fact that the KEMG exam and the ENMG exam are both in need of refreshing, and that can be a very costly expense. You might remember hearing reports about having to do with the jurisprudence exam and how much that cost. The EN and EK, it's very difficult to anticipate what those costs would be because we have very limited access to subject matter experts. We only administer this exam about once every 2 years to 1 or 2 applicants, and we only issue one of these certifications about once a year on average for like the last 10 years. So there aren't a lot of them. There's only about 40 that we know of in the state of California that are valid licenses, and some of them now reside outside of the state of California in practice. So they would be, whether we could access them as a subject matter expert is debatable. To identify this an issue for Sunset, one of the things to consider is maybe something that supplements the examination, like an outside certification or something like that. But it is something that is in need of repair, if you will.
I liked the idea of using the certification, except I have one problem with it, which is there's a considerable cost associated with it. And in fact, you must maintain a membership in
Correct.
the specialty to be able to maintain your certification.
Correct.
And so,
And that cost
big
is
barrier.
And that cost is about 3 times what the current cost of the KEMG and the ENMG costs are. And then, in consideration of that, whatever we end up deciding to do with this, if creation of a new exam is what the decision is, costs will come with that as well. So while the costs that we administer today are based off of the old exam, they might change as well.
But I think there's a difference in passing on what's a true cost of the state to provide that
Absolutely.
licensure,
Mhm.
as opposed to saying we deem some outside agency and now
Correct.
you're subject to their costs.
Yep. And so it's a good point as far as consideration of whether it should be identified as an issue in sunset. If it's the wish of the board to move forward with just modernizing the current exam, then no legislative change is required. So it's not really a topic for sunset at that point. That's really just the idea that lands it in this report.
Jason, do we know when the exam was last modified?
The exam was last modified in 1998.
And my guess is, I believe that there's not much that's changed in the way of nerve and muscle function to be able to come up with new questions. But
We will need subject matter experts to opine on that.
Thank you.
But I do think the issue might, I would suggest that the issue continue on your list of issues, because it is a small group of licensees that has a responsibility behind it to maintain all that. And so I would keep it as an issue.
The other, I guess, angle or perspective for this particular issue is there are other forms or modalities in physical therapy that require advanced training. But this is the only one that's been identified that requires some kind of special certification. And it's important to note why it required some special certification. And that's the fact that tissue penetration was involved. And while we don't have a direct prohibition of tissue penetration in our Practice Act, there is one in the Medical Practice Act. And so this specialty certification was a compromise, if you will, between two professions at the time to say physical therapists could do this if they could prove advanced training. I can tell you that it's also important to note I've never confined in my research a complaint about a physical therapist conducting either an ENMG or consulting academically as a KEMG. There's no reason to believe through statistics that they're unsafe to do so.
I have heard complaints from electromyographers about the problem that the process for licensure in California is significantly more burdensome than what it is in other states.
Correct.
To be able to get this. So,
And that's a direct relation to that prohibition of tissue penetration.
Yeah.
Those states don't have that in their Practice Act or don't have a conflict with another Practice Act. So there is no specialty certification to practice that. That's part of their normal knowledge, skills, and abilities in those states. California is unique. So another consideration.
In addition to, you mentioned dry needling earlier, which is one of the newer hot topics.
Absolutely.
Not so new, but it is relatively new.
So I think we determined we'd like to keep that on the list of things to do for sunset. Would you like to talk to us about JAM?
Maybe not necessarily the JAM itself, but a fresh look at the jurisprudence exam. Right now, the jurisprudence exam is held to the same standard as the NPTE or the National Physical Therapy Examination as far as psychometric validity, security, and pass point. So if it is the will of the board to look at it in a different light as an educational tool as opposed to an exam, but still a requirement for licensure, sunset might be also an opportunity to have that discussion as well.
I say let's discuss it.
Yeah, let's keep it on there.
And then I guess the great unknown is, are there any other topics that are sunset worthy that the board would like to recommend to staff?
Does the board have to present them here, or could they contact staff or the committee in the future to make suggestions?
They would have to come through a normally noticed meeting.
Okay, thank you.
But that doesn't mean that whoever on the committee can't come up with additional ideas during the committee, since it will be brought back. These are just for your consideration at this time and for you to offer additional ones.
Thank you, Angelique.
Maybe a consideration, I'll throw this out there because I believe I've heard this discussed before, considering whether or not you want individuals who have had revoked licenses for a certain period of time be required to take some type of examination before re-entering the practice. Just throw it out there because I've heard it, but discussed by board members.
So we're not currently requiring licensees who are petitioning for reinstatement to take an
So
exam?
we have, through our model guidelines and regulation, we do have a requirement for the jurisprudence exam. But for a practical exam such as the MPTE, it could be done through stipulation, but for a disciplinary order and as part of the model guidelines itself, there would be a statutory change required.
So if we had someone who surrendered their license or had their license revoked without a probationary order and who's actually been out there for a few years, whether or not that's something that the board wants to consider.
Yeah, I think we could add that to the list of things to discuss at the committee level. Are there any other topics that the board would like to consider for Sunset Committee?
I've got a quick point of clarification. Was there a determination as to whether or not you wanted to keep the retired license fee on the list for further discussion? It seemed like we
Oh, good
moved
catch.
over to continuing competency to resolve that, but I don't know that we had a decision on the retired license fee.
Oh, we talked about the caps, but we didn't talk about the
Right. So with SB 198, we received the authority to provide an exemption from renewal for those that have retired status. And while they do have retired status, and they are less of a burden on the board, they are still an administrative burden in the sense that we will still be receiving any kind of subsequent arrest notification for them, and they are considered a renewable license. So if it's deemed appropriate, as it has been with some other boards and bureaus, that a lower dollar amount be attributed as a fair share concept for retired, this would be an opportunity to include it as well.
I would suggest that it stay as an issue.
I agree. Does legal counsel have any more recommendations for us to consider?
No, none at this time. Thank you.
Hearing none from the board, staff, do you have any additional recommendations?
Not that I can think of.
Just the ones in the agenda book? Okay, well, I think our next step is to determine whether what we've identified requires the skills and expertise of professional members or are 2 public members sufficient based on what we've just discussed? I think everything can benefit from a professional member's perspective, so I wouldn't rule that out. But I also, to speak to your concerns, TJ, wouldn't necessarily think it's a requirement. Do you have any members that would like to volunteer to participate in the committee?
Want to take maybe like a straw poll and see how available
Straw poll?
they are, if they're interested?
Okay.
They don't all jump at it at once. You know, easy.
I can't line
easy.
myself up with.
It's like pulling teeth. So sure, let's start at the end down there.
At the end?
Yeah.
I could help. It might be a little bit of a challenge for me,
Okay.
but I could.
I can create the time, but it would be more of a, I don't know how much I can contribute to the overall process if it goes too much into the professional technical aspect. I mean, I run the ship aground no matter how much I try. So
I
it's
appreciate
not,
that
it's
analogy.
definitely a willingness. So that's why I stand. I can create the time.
No.
Could you clarify? Against probably better judgment, I am interested, and I'm reasonably sure that I can make time to be able to work on it, provided the oven will allow me to go.
So just one point of clarity for recommendation from staff. When you say, and this goes for all of you, when you say make time, time in person or time on the phone or time, in teleconference or, it's important that I think that from experience's sake, that face-to-face time is important in this particular process.
I was going to ask, can you tell us what you need? What you're looking at?
Ideally, what I'd like to be able to do is with a week or two's notice, schedule a full day's worth of work. And experience has shown me that it was a very valuable component to be able to go lock us all up in a room, in the Lake Tahoe room, and hash some of these things out to provide a recommendation to the rest of the board. So in-person time is very important.
And that's Lake Tahoe room, not Lake Tahoe, for clarification.
Thank you for that.
A room in Lake Tahoe?
No. At the Lake Tahoe room at the 2005 Evergreen Street in the Department of Consumer Affairs building, Sacramento, California.
So on the heels of that clarification, no?
So keep in mind that my next ask at that point is also to add at least one board meeting to 2 to the calendar for the committee's recommendations to make it to the board for discussion as a group.
And this is a teleconference or is
Either
it in
or.
person?
And again, I think face-to-face is very valuable in this process.
Yeah, I think just considering the week's notice and the full day of work is going to be tough for me.
Okay.
Does anybody want to change their response down there based on the additional information Jason has provided? I know Tanya has definitely not changed her position. Okay. Alicia?
I sit in the same spot as Deb. I could help. I can try and make time. Yeah.
It's highly improper of me to do this, but I do see some value in recommendations for candidacy for this committee, in that there is a professional member and a public member that are rather local, if you will, in the vice president and in Mr. Watkins, it may be easier travel-wise to be able to come to our board, being from Stockton and Sacramento, than relying on some of the Southern California members. And there is a balance there between public and professional member at that point.
This is like playing poker.
Yeah, yeah. Can you repeat that?
From a very selfish perspective through staff and the administration of this report, the fact that you are local to this address is important to us. Accessibility would be a very key factor. Scheduling and being sensitive of the time that and commitment that it would require from you, it would make it easier for us to ask you a week in advance to come from Stockton to Sacramento or from Sacramento to Sacramento, and less of a task for staff to have to accommodate travel and airline flights and those kind of things. So, and I think that it's reasonable given the expectation of time, and that the board will still be given the second part of this presentation, if I can add 2 calendar dates and have you all here, a good conduit for information and accessibility.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I'm willing.
I volunteered you a little bit. I probably should have given you a heads up. I'm sorry. It just came to me, though.
So that makes 2. I volunteered and Alicia has volunteered, so I think that's sufficient for staff, correct?
It is.
Okay. Now, does the calendaring of the meetings need to be done in open session?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm confused.
And that's a different part of this component.
I'm confused, so I think Jason just proposed TJ and Alicia
As an alternative.
being, oh, okay.
Yeah. Taking volunteers into account, I mean, that's a big deal.
I think Jason's happy with whatever he can get at this
I
point.
am at this point.
But then you just said you and Alicia, so I wanted to clarify that.
Yes, I had volunteered initially before we did the Stropple. And I think that since Alicia has volunteered, did
And
you want to? Go ahead, Jason.
Just a clarification I want to make clear is travel is not an issue coming from Southern California from you?
I can make time.
Okay. I'm good.
Okay, so I was
So-
rightly confused.
Madam President, you've appointed a 2-person committee for the actual sunset review report, and those 2 members on the 2-member committee are yourself and the vice president.
Correct.
Thank you.
And that's a motion, I would imagine. No?
No, because committees are at the pleasure of the board president.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the next topic on the agenda then I guess would be to consider dates or the need for dates for upcoming meetings in the month of September and October.
Strike that, let me go back. We do want to make sure that it's clear what you're designating this committee to do, and that you're designating a committee to come up with board issues for the board sunset review report, and to, what's the other specific item that you have? To work with staff in preparing a draft sunset review report to be brought to the full board for consideration. Is that the intent of the committee?
Yes.
Thank you.
Now, the dates we're selecting right now, Jason, is for the full board, or is this for the committee?
I think some discussion needs to be had with that. So, and part of that might be the board's availability or consideration of priority. So there is room that we could do a teleconference, but again, just from experience's sake, this is a very this can be a very lengthy, tedious process where we put this document up on the wall and we fishbowl it and work through it. And so having everyone in attendance can be very valuable. If that's the case and the board concurs and we want to do a meeting in September and then again in October, I guess I'd be staunch in my request that I'd at least like to have one full board meeting in Sacramento in the month of October to prepare that final draft for the November meeting. It would be our last opportunity at that point.
So the committee should meet prior to the full board meeting in October to help prepare the draft with staff?
I would hope that the committee would start meeting in September, early, maybe next week. Telephonically or in person, whatever I can get. If I could, I would look at September 21st and a one-day meeting, September 21st, and then another one-day meeting on either October 19th or 26th.
And you're
I'm
refer-
also open to not always a Wednesday. It's not necessarily has to be a Wednesday. If other days work, that's fine. But the latter part of each month, I think, is probably the best way to spread the work out.
Are you talking about committee meetings or board meetings?
Board meetings.
Board meetings, okay.
Does it have to be on a weekday?
That is entirely up to the board.
I think somebody needs to throw out a date and we say yes or no.
September 23rd, Friday.
No.
September 16th.
Friday's tough for me.
Friday's tough for you. Gotcha. How about Mondays?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's hard, or yes, it's good?
Monday's okay.
Okay. Monday the 12th.
Saturdays are okay.
Are we talking about the board meeting?
You're
We're talking about a board meeting.
There is one day in the week where I do not have a pretty significant teaching obligation. That would be Thursdays
Okay.
through December.
So I would throw out September 22nd,
Mm-hmm.
possibly.
If we could do early morning, that would be good for me. How long do you anticipate this meeting being? 4 hours?
There's a full day's worth of business, I think, easily
Okay.
at these meetings. So, the other thing, just from experience's sake, is when we have had these additional calendared meetings for Sunset, we've added other business to them as it arose. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we have to do it this time, but disciplinary matters, those kind of things, if they came up, were included into those meetings in 2011. So, Thursday the 22nd and possibly October the 27th, I think, are spread out fairly well, considering the November meeting is now 16th and 17th.
These are in person, right?
Correct. Again, unless the board sees a teleconference as a more valuable tool to use in, say, the month of September or October or something like that.
So the dates that are on the table are Thursday, September 22nd, and Thursday, October 27th. Do any board members have any conflicts on those dates or any objections?
Well, here I go. Great on the 22nd, but of September, the 27th of October, our students are actually gone, which would be a good thing, except I'm in a conference on that Thursday, the 27th.
What about-
Otherwise, I would have been free.
What about the 20th?
I'm not available.
Are you available on a day other than a Thursday that week?
Yep, let me look. Sorry. Monday, the 24th of October. Yeah, Tuesday, the 25th of October. Wednesday, the 26th of October. They're gone that week. Unfortunately, I have a conference that Thursday and Friday, 27, 28.
So it sounds like Monday, October 24th might work for everyone?
How does the 25th work? 25th, going once?
Monday, the 24th,
Tuesday, the 25th,
Tuesday, the 25th?
going once, going twice?
Does that work okay? 26th is not great for me, so.
Okay. It works fine for us. And what I'm really looking at is an interval of time that, based on working with the committee and also letting that first draft be seen by the full board and discussions to be had, that those changes can be made from one meeting to the next to be reviewed and then gone over again. So a 30-day period in between for us works really well.
So we have confirmed September 22nd, which is a Thursday, and Tuesday, October 25th. And these are board meetings in person in Sacramento,
Correct.
the Tahoe room, not a room in Tahoe. And is that fine building up until November? We're good?
I believe so.
Okay. And now the committee meetings, do those need to be set today since they're not publicly noticed?
No.
Okay. Can we meet offline,
That's
Alicia
right.
and I could to schedule those? Okay. Great. Is there anything else that you need from the board regarding agenda item number 12?
If there are any other questions about the sunset process itself that any of the board's members might have, before we leave this topic, I'd be happy to answer them to the best that I can. Since we are now this deep into the process, one of the things that I'd recommend is going to our YouTube page and watching the previous hearing. And I'll make sure that that's posted so you can access it from that point. You can always go to Cal Channel through the legislative website and access it that way, but we can put it on our YouTube channel and it'll be a little bit easier to see. It's a good experience to see what kind of testimony is provided, and it's also not a bad idea to watch the sunsetting of another board or bureau.
Would you mind sending us those, Jason, so we don't have to fish for them?
Absolutely. That'll
Thank
be
you.
part of a link.
Great. Well, I think we have accomplished everything on today's agenda. Is there any public comment on the discussion of agenda item number 12? Any further board comment? Okay, then I'm going to suggest we recess until tomorrow. We will reconvene at 9 a.m.